right, let's talk about a story of freedom you probably didn't learn in school. We're diving into the fight for Hyderabad, a struggle that really kicked into high gear after the rest of India was already celebrating its independence. It's a fascinating, complex piece of history. Let's get into it. Think about it. For most of India, August 15th, 1947 was the finish line, the end of a long, hard fight against the British. But what if that date wasn't the end? What if it was just a new, even more complicated chapter? Well, for millions of people living in the princely state of Hyderabad, that's exactly what it was. Exactly. While a new nation of India was figuring itself out, the people of Hyderabad were still trapped. They were just starting their own fight, and it wasn't a simple one. This was a battle on multiple fronts, against an old feudal system, an autocratic ruler, and some pretty brutal militias. So, to really get what this fight was all about, you have to understand Hyderabad itself. Under its last Nizam, Mir Osman Ali Khan, the state was just a land of wild contradictions. It had this shiny, modern surface, but underneath was a reality that was anything but. I mean, just look at this. It's like two different worlds. On one side, you've got the Nizam building these impressive, modern institutions, a major university, a state bank, huge dams. Hyderabad even had its own money. But step outside the city, and it was a different story. The reality for most people was a brutal feudal system run by landlords called jagardars, absolutely no democratic rights, and this cruel practice of forced unpaid labor they called veti. And this right here, this shows you the real human cost of the Nizam's rule. See, the official language of the state, the language of power, was Urdu, but almost nobody spoke it. The vast majority spoke Telugu, Marathi, or Kannada. So by pushing Urdu and suppressing local languages, the government basically created an education crisis. Look at that literacy rate in 1941, a shocking 9.3%. Compare that to another princely state like Travancore, which was already pushing almost 48%. It's a huge difference.
So where does the first spark of resistance come from? Well, it didn't start with a political party or a call for revolution. Nope, it started with something way more fundamental, a fight for language, for culture, for basic dignity. It was pride in their own language that got the whole movement started.
This was the core problem. Everything important, the government, the courts, the universities, it all ran on Urdu, a language that most of the population didn't even speak. This basically locked people out of opportunity and made them feel like foreigners in their own home. The whole thing boiled over in 1921. At a public meeting, a guy was publicly humiliated just for trying to speak in Telugu. And that one insult just lit a fire under people. So what did they do? They didn't start a riot. They formed a group called the Andhra Jana Sangam, and their mission was genius: to build libraries. These weren't just quiet places to read. They were an act of cultural defiance. And, as you can probably guess, a movement that starts with saving a language isn't going to stay just cultural for long. Pretty soon, these libraries and reading rooms turned into something much, much bigger. They became the secret nerve centers for a growing political resistance. You can really see the evolution here, step by step. First, the libraries are just safe places for people to gather, read, and talk about their problems without the Nizam's spies listening in. That talk naturally turns into organization. By 1930, the cultural group becomes the Andhra Mahasabha, and they start pushing for social reforms. And finally, by 1938, it all leads to the Hyderabad State Congress, which started making straight-up political demands for a democratic government. Now, while all this political organizing was happening in the towns, something else was brewing out in the villages. Decades of pure oppression were reaching a breaking point. For the peasants who were living under this awful feudal system, making polite demands just wasn't cutting it anymore. The whole movement was about to take a very radical, very violent turn. And to get why, you have to understand this one word, Vrjiti. This wasn't just about paying taxes. This was basically a system of slavery. The local landlords, the Shindaras, could force peasants to work for them for free. Anytime, any reason, it was a life of endless work, exploitation, and total humiliation. And here it is, the spark that lit the whole region on fire, July 4th, 1946. During a protest, a local leader named Dadi Kamaraya was shot and killed by a landlord's goon. His death was the final straw. That simmering anger exploded into an open, armed rebellion that we now call the Telangana Armed Struggle. And you know what? This armed struggle was incredibly effective. Village committees, or sangams, popped up everywhere. They formed their own guerrilla squads, and they got to work. They kicked out the landlords, they immediately got rid of veti, they burned all the old land and debt records that had kept their families trapped for generations, and they started giving the land back to the poor. Women like Chakali Alama became absolute legends, symbols of this powerful defiance.
So now we get to the absolute climax of this whole story between 1947 and 1948. India is independent, and Hyderabad becomes this total pressure cooker. You've got three major groups fighting for control: the Nizam's violent militia, the communist-led peasant rebels, and the new government of India, which is watching all of this very closely. To hold on to his power, the Nizam unleashed his own private army, a fanatical militia called the Razakars. Their job was simple and brutal: use terror and violence to crush anyone who wanted democracy or wanted to join India. They became a force of pure, absolute terror. This timeline just shows you how fast everything went off the rails. The armed struggle kicks off in 46. A year later, India is free, but the Nizam says, nope, Hyderabad is my own independent country. That sparks a year of unbelievable violence from the Razakars. It's chaos. And finally, in September 1948, the Indian government says, okay, that's enough, and sends in the army. You know, with all this talk of armies and politics, it's easy to forget what this was really about. This quote from Kamalama, a woman who actually fought in the struggle, just hits so hard. For her, it wasn't about some grand political idea. It was about escaping a life of abuse and slavery. For thousands of people just like her, this fight was about one thing: getting back their basic human dignity. The arrival of the Indian Army, which was called a police action, was fast and it was decisive. It put an end to one of the most violent and complicated sagas in modern Indian history, and it finally marked the start of a new chapter for the people of Hyderabad. It was over in just a few days. The Razakars folded, the Nizam surrendered, and so September 17th, 1948, a full 13 months after the rest of the country celebrated, became Hyderabad's real Independence Day. The Nizam's dream was done. So what was the biggest, most lasting result of that peasant struggle? This number says it all. 10 lakh acres. That's an estimated 1 million acres of land that was taken from the feudal landlords and given to the landless peasants who had worked it for generations. That's not just a policy change, that is a massive social revolution. Now, the political change didn't happen overnight. It was a bit more gradual. At first, they actually kept the Nizam around as a sort of ceremonial governor, but by 1952, the state held its very first democratic elections. And then, in 1956, when India redrew its state boundaries based on language, the Nizam's old position was completely eliminated. The old rule was officially and finally over. So, in the end, this was way more than just a political merger. It was the complete takedown of a centuries-old feudal system. The Nizam's absolute power was gone, the grip of the landlords was broken, and for the very first time, the people of Hyderabad actually had a say in their own future. But, you know, history is never quite that simple, is it? One fight ended, but you could argue another one was just beginning. All those powerful feelings that started this whole thing, the linguistic pride, the unique regional identity, the demand for dignity, they didn't just vanish. Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. How did this incredible, bloody fight for freedom in the 1940s plant the seeds for the modern movement for a separate Telangana state decades down the line? Now that's something to chew on.